What is a complete human? Is it a cover model? Is it a science geek? Is it a fitness expert? Or all of the above and more? Jana and Evan are crusaders that walk the earth looking at today's issues that touch our hearts and minds. The honest and hopeful outlook on the advancement of today's society. The science behind the decay of human relationships. The necessary preparations for future generations. Join us as we look deep inside ourselves and embark on a journey into becoming a complete human.
Also get your take on people that have taken antibiotics. I've heard and seen that, if you've taken some, sometimes you deal with some mood issues afterwards, depression, anxiety, but also some sort of research about if you've taken, at least, a round of antibiotics throughout your life, there's certain markers that just change drastically throughout your entire life. I mean, maybe you can heal your gut a little bit, but still your immune system is down a little bit more than people who have never taken any. And if you take, reoccurrent antibiotics, or if you're using them frequently, what does that do long-term to our health?
So antibiotics are a great invention of the last, history, I don't know, about 100, 200 years, let's say.
Yeah.
So I don't want anybody to think it's not amazing that we
Correct.
have that. The problem is that they don't differentiate between good and bad bacteria. So one of the common side effects of taking the antibiotic is that you get diarrhea. Why? Because all the bacteria in your gut are also being affected by them. So, and then what happens is you could actually wipe out entire colonies of species, and usually they come back. It might take between 3, 6, 12 months to come back properly. And we've looked at that, because folks in the office, in the lab, have been on antibiotics, and we immediately, take their bloods and sample them to see how long it takes. It takes a long time. But if you've been doing this for, a year, 2 years, 3 years, you could end up really just wiping out your entire microbiome. If you do that, you suddenly become susceptible to things like eczema, things like autoimmune conditions, inflammation, to your point, emotional issues, because you actually damage the lining of the intestine. And the intestinal lining is just one cell thick, super, super thin. So if you do anything to damage it, then what ends up happening is those cells that are closely packed together, they can start to separate a little bit, and it causes material to leak in between those cells. So rather than the nutrients being absorbed through the little finger-like projections in the small intestine called microvilli, those nutrients start to go in the wrong place. And what's actually living right below those cells is this area called the lamina propria. It's where your immune system hangs out. So if you end up with what's called leaky gut or any kind of intestinal permeability issues, it hyper sensitizes your immune system, because your immune system doesn't know the difference between that taco you had for lunch and anything else. So, you end up creating inflammation right in the body. So it's so important to keep that intestinal lining healthy, to not wipe out the gut microbiome, because it can take a long, long time for things to come back. And then as it's healing, you're also not getting all the nutritional absorption that you need, because those bacteria are there to take the foods that you're eating, to break them down into an absorbable thing that your body can then use. If there's no bacteria there to break down the celery or carrots that you're eating, just an example.
Or the taco,
or the taco, I love tacos, then you get zero nutritional value from anything that you're eating. So it's kind of a two-pronged issue, right? What are you putting in, and what is actually being digested and absorbed? And those two things together have to work in concert with each other in order for the right thing to happen.
And with the prevalence of antibiotics being used, I mean, obviously, since the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and I think that the medical community just, without perhaps knowing, was like, let's just throw antibiotics at it. I mean, I remember even my daughter, she had a virus, and they're like, let's give her antibiotics. I'm like, what are you doing? Like, and I think back to a lot of friends that I know who have gut issues, and there's this trend of frequent antibiotic use as kids, as young adults. I know you've had that. So as you guys have tested this time and time again, what percentage of people really are suffering from perhaps a overuse of antibiotics that have led to gut permeability or leaky gut, or, these things that we're talking about?
No, I don't know. I mean, we don't always ask that question, so I'm not entirely certain, but I would tell you that it's probably 10 to 20%, which is a pretty large percent of folks who, whether you had recurrent ear infections as a child, C-section babies have issues with gut microbiome, issues, and are more susceptible to sickness and illness. So there's definitely a cohort that grew up having taken these meds. And, I think part of the challenge is, physicians for again, not meaning badly, right? If the child has an infection or an adult has an infection and nothing is helping, then they give an antibiotic. Sometimes they do that because there might be a secondary infection, right? So you had that virus, and then underneath that virus, because that virus went too long, there's a secondary infection, but they don't always know. It's a little bit of a guess, right? It's just if your symptoms haven't gone away in a fast enough time, and to some extent, we're impatient. We don't want to be sick for longer than a week, right? The minute you're sick for longer than a week, you're like, I don't want to do this anymore. Somebody help me, give me something. And so the impatience of that, I think, makes the user go to the doctor too and demand for some of these things. And the doctor can't always just be like, no, I'm not going to give it to you. So there's a variety of factors, right, that cause this. And then, of course, too much antibiotic use means antibiotic resistant bacteria, which creates other problems. And but all of it wreaks great havoc, of course, on the gut microbiome.
Yeah.